whole load of changes to heroes and gameplay. In today's patch, all objectives will now take 50% less damage from spirit-related damage. Alongside that, shrines are no longer vulnerable to spirit damage when you're out of range, akin to bullet damage. And finally, you can no longer stand on top of walkers. Oh boy, that and a whole lot more, tons of hero changes inside of January 27th's update for Deadlock. Let's get into it and see what exactly Valve have been cooking up in the cursed apple kitchen. First and foremost, Detective Abrams. The man on your screen has undergone one slight tweak inside of this patch, and that is one digit, literally. Up from 11% to 12% in damage regenerated with use of Infernal Resilience. His passive, of course, giving him regeneration of incoming damage over time. So a very slight buff there for those of you that want to get out on the streets as Abrams. Meanwhile, we can move on over to the junk golem himself and have a look what Valve have done to Bebop. Exploding uppercut. Air control, lockout period for this is going to be reduced from 0.5 seconds to 0.3 seconds. So another minor tweak to Bebop there inside of today's update. But let's slide on down and see what's going on with Dr. Dynamo. Here he is. Dynamo has actually had a couple of tweaks inside of today's patch. It's all to do with Kinetic Pulse. Kinetic Pulse, of course, your knock-up that can be a pretty powerful ability when used smartly, will now have spirit scaling increased from 1.4 to 1.8. So a bit of a buff there, 0.4% increase on the spirit scaling of this bad boy for Kinetic Pulse. But that's not the only change that Valve have made. At tier 3, you're also now going to have an additional charge. So you'll be able to have 2 charges of this, get them off relatively quickly as well, pretty much back to back. So another nice buff for any Dynamo mains out there. We'll roll on over though and see if the cat's meow is here literally. Because we're talking Calico. Now, Calico has actually had some major earth-shattering buffs inside of this patch alongside some tweaks. We'll start off with the tweaks. Let's talk about those gloomy bombs themselves. They've had their sound effects updated, so have a listen. You can see as well, they've also added an arming effect to those gloom bombs so you know when they're about to detonate. Moving on though, Leaping Slash. Quite a few changes to this one, mostly seem to be bug fix related in terms of now only being able to heal off attacking enemies rather than friendlies as well. And of course tweaks to the visual effects to match the damage area far more accurately. Alongside that, the slash will now break open breakables. Much like we got that tweak to Ava in the previous patch where running through breakables would shatter them, you can now slice them as well. Whilst we're on the topic of Ava the cat, let's get into the huge game-changing buff that she's received after we talk about a couple of changes. I know I keep teasing it, but it is a big one. Ava, of course, here has had some adjustments to her speed, her cooldown. I mean, overall, it doesn't really change things too much. It kind of balances out. Obviously, we're seeing a lot of Ava propaganda right now where everyone wants you to play Ava-only Calico, and that is still viable, but there's a couple of gameplay tweaks to balance that. You're going to be slowed now if you take damage, and they've moved over some of that additional burst of speed from tier 1 into tier 2. But here is the big change. You can now meow with left click. Listen to this. Oh boy, insanity, isn't it? Okay, well, Return to Shadows has also had a minor nerf. That's 10 seconds on the cooldown there. So your ultimate being on CD slightly longer. Not going to ruin Calico. Obviously, she's incredibly popular right now. Everyone and their mothers are playing Calico, and I don't imagine that will change. Let's slide on down to the subway, though, and see what Grey Talon has been up to. Grey Talon has received a couple of tweaks inside of tonight's balance patch as well, notably all to do with Spirit Snare. Of course, that's going to be his trap that he puts down. If you're unfamiliar, you run into this bad boy, it springs, slows you right in place, and you've got no option to get away. Well, cooldown is going to be reduced on this. It's going to be going down by a couple seconds from 37 to 34, and the actual snare length itself is going to be buffed ever so slightly when it's in tier 2. Moving over on to Haze now. Let's see what she's had done to her. For Haze, it's interesting that this is actually going to be a buff, mostly just talking about Bullet Dance, specifically tier 3 of Bullet Dance. I always love the way this looks, by the way, when showing it off in slow motion. Incredible animation for what is a work in progress character. That's going to be the tier 3 evasion stats upped by 20% from 40 to 60, and Bullet Dance move speed up from +2 to +3. So some tweaks there. But we can bounce on over and see what Holliday has gotten up to. Some changes to Holliday inside of this patch. Obviously, if you only read the patch notes, they can actually come across a little bit confusing with this one, so we'll dissect them bit by bit, starting off with Powder Keg. Now, Powder Keg has had a couple of changes. It says that it will no longer arm instantly if the player has the bounce pad modifier, of course, when using that bounce pad for the initial time with the stomp effect. Charge time is also going to be up by 1 second, from 1 second to 2 seconds, and knock-up time is going to be reduced by 15%. Now we can move on to bounce pads and see what they've done there. They've added a new sound, so you'll be able to identify if a player is using a bounce pad with a stomp or if it's just a regular bounce pad. Of course, it only happens that first time. You can also see they have a new ring and indication visually of when they're going to expire, rather than it feeling a bit more random. And they won't expire after being in air for 5 seconds, is what it says in the patch notes. Alongside that, spirit scaling for these is going to be going down quite a significant amount, from 0.9 to 0.4. And then we've had a couple of tweaks as well alongside that for Spirit Lasso. Bug fixes, minor adjustments in reality for what it is. You will get an increased duration though when using the bounce pad and your lasso, so something to think about. But let's climb on up and see what's gone on with Kelvin. Obviously, you remember last time around, Kelvin was the only character that felt like he got a buff in the previous balance patch, with everyone else receiving nerfs, and he's done it again. Everyone's favorite Arctic man is buffed up. This time around, you're going to be slowing roll distance by 20% when tagging players with the Arctic beam. But we can drop straight down and see what else has changed. And this one might shock you. Not for any reason, it's just 7. Back on screen here. Now with 7, obviously it's to do with his ultimate Storm Cloud, but this is going to be the second ability of that ultimate. So that's going to be the lightning bolt that you can cast down. Quite a significant reduction on this one in terms of the cast time. Obviously, I think people felt like it was a bit annoying, a bit hard to actually get those hits off with that secondary ability for the ultimate. Now it should be far, far easier. So super, super nice buff there in terms of that instantaneous feeling of response with his ult. Moving on to Shiv though. They've made it so it will no longer stop his knives after hitting a soul orb, so you can get those confirms off and it will still continue to potentially deal damage to the player you're laning against, or maybe if you're lucky, someone that's just wandering past enjoying the scenery. So obviously a couple tweaks there to his serrated knives. But he's going to go running on off and we'll get ourselves ready for the show, because we've got the magnificent, the wonderful, the Sinclair. Of course, Sinclair has had some tweaks, and I found this one very interesting. He no longer has a minus 35% headshot damage reduction. Now, if you deduce from this, in reality, what's happened here is where they've copied over a lot of the baseline stats from 7, I think they've just accidentally applied this to him. Now, upon realizing, have removed that reduction. It was never intended. So yeah, a bit of an unintentional buff out of what was a unintentional nerf. Moving on though, bit of a redevelopment here in terms of how you are seeing him use Vexing Bolt. Vexing Bolt now effectively is going to be more powerful the longer it's in the air. There's obviously some breakdown on that in terms of the statistics, but yeah, a bit of a change on that one. Obviously, moving over here as well, you can see that things have gotten a bit creepy. Savannah, the assistant for Henry, seems to be completely broken in terms of the model as of the time of recording. Maybe this has been fixed already, but yeah, a bit broken in the release version of this patch as it came to recording today's episode of Patch Notice. You can also now jump when in rabbit mode. If you get hit with that hex, you'll be able to leap up into the air. They also said they made some changes to the hex in terms of how this is going to be able to better track other targets that have recently changed models. So I imagine if you have Calico turning into Ava, it could have been throwing off the tracking somewhat, but that's been adjusted now and should be better. Audience participation as well has had quite a few changes to it. So cooldown with successful usage has been reduced from 100% to 50%. Stolen ultimate duration is going to be up by an additional 10 seconds. The VFX have been changed to feel a bit snappier, and they fixed the typo in the description. Vindicta, though, is going to be next on the docket for today's balance patch, and this is a bit of a tweak to Wolfhour's Revenge. That's the name of her gun. If you're unfamiliar, that's going to be bullet damage reduction down by a few decimal points there, so making it a little bit more in line with some of the other heroes off the back, of course, the major meta-changing patch we had recently, where bullet damage and gun-related builds kind of got thrown in the bin. Speed on her crows is also going to be brought down ever so slightly from 4750 to 4250. And her Assassinate Tier 2 is going to be reduced from plus 120 to just plus 110. So 10 points of damage taken away from her snipe there. So just some slight tweaks to Vindicta in today's update, but let's look upwards and onwards to our big green friend from the deep, deep below. It's Viscous. Viscous has only received one minor buff inside of today's update, and that's going to be the goo ball turn rate improved by 10%. So a slight buff for the goo fandom. Gooners, I believe you call yourselves. Moving on, though, from the big green guy to the green gal from Staten Island. It's Vyper. Now, the Rattler has received a buff. Bullet damage growth is going to be going up from 0.32 to 0.36. So that's actually been increased ever so slightly. They've also made a bit of a change. Well, in reality, it's not a change as much as it feels like it's probably just a fix in terms of unintended gameplay. So Petrifying Bowler will now not be breakable. You can't get out of it with an item or a cleanse. There's no way to remove that. Moving over, you can also see that Lethal Venom has been updated to deal damage through Petrify rather than cleansing it and then dealing damage. So it's going to work as intended now, with that effect of leaving you petrified and also getting the poison damage over time onto you. So things to be aware of when playing against Vyper if you weren't already scared of her. Moving on, though, let's have a look at the item changes. Ammo Scavenger is going to have its ammo reduced from 15% to 10%, so a bit of a reduction on that one. Swift Striker has also had its fire rate being reduced by 2%, so only a minor reduction on that, but it could make the difference, down from 22 to just 20. Base damage has also been reduced from 50 to 45 on Alchemical Fire, which continues to have some tweaks inside of each and every balance update. Spellslinger Headshots has two changes here, with amp per headshot damage being increased from 4% to 6%, and those max stacks going down slightly by 2 as well. Heroic Aura has had its lifesteal reduced by 2% from 18 to only 16, and then we can move on to Berserker. Damage to gain stack has been increased from 100 to 120, so those weapon damage stacks that are being changed slightly in terms of requirement, and Bullet lifesteal has been reduced by 2% from 26 down to 24. And with that, it's done. That's the patch. That's everything we've seen changed. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode of Patch Notice. A new episode of the Dead Air podcast will be coming out this weekend with a very special guest. Other than that, I hope you've enjoyed today's Patch Notice. Like, subscribe if you want to, and we will see you next time.